all participants in this roundtable discussion, not only those that are in the panel, but also everyone that is following us through social media. It is an honor for the International Relations Institute of the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro to host the event. I would like to thank the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs for our cooperation and the involvement of NEDEFA, the nucleus that studies defense and the armed forces at the Catholic University here in Rio, and also our professional master's degree program for organizing, helping us organize the event. We're in the middle of a pandemic, all of us, and the pandemic is stimulating important changes in world politics, hopefully in the direction of increasing international cooperation and the re-strengthening of multilateral institutions. And in this context, it's absolutely crucial to discuss UN peace operations, and that is the object of our roundtable. We have an excellent number of scholars and colleagues with us in the roundtable. I would like to greet each one of you. Initially, Ambassador Antonio Patriota, which besides our academic collaboration, we had the chance to work together very closely in our national government. Katharina Coleman from the University of British Columbia, Connor Foley, which is here with us at the International Relations Institute in Rio. Kai, also our professor at the International Relations Institute in Rio. Carl Oslin from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Mateja Peter from the University of St. Andrews. And Paul Williams from George Washington University. I graduated from Georgetown University, so we're neighbors, I consider. And the floor of the roundtable will be held by Ambassador Antonio Patriota. I will pass the floor immediately to him, but wishing you utmost success in the discussions of the roundtable.
Thank you so much. It certainly is a pleasure for me to be involved in this project and to see you again very active. And congratulations to the Pontifical Catholic University for having hired somebody of your intellectual capacity and professional experience. I'm very happy to be part of a discussion on a subject that I have followed on and off, but the papers that I read helped me to somehow update my understanding of where some of the debate is today regarding peace operations. I'll start by saying that the discussion has become very timely in light of Brazil's recent election to a non-permanent seat, Security Council, on the 11th of June. So we will be back for our 11th term in the Security Council starting January 2022. As you know, Brazil is a developing country that has participated for the greatest number of years as a non-permanent member in the Security Council. And we will now be on a par with Japan with 11 mandates. Before I address to you some questions or some topics for debate, let me say a few introductory remarks. It has become commonplace to say that multilateralism is facing a crisis. The truth is that in its 75 years history, the UN has managed to overcome many problematic periods, the Cold War and bipolarity, the unipolar moment, which Celso Marin used to say, unilateralism through multilateralism. Today, of course, with the new challenges, but I am confident, as some of you in your papers have mentioned, that the system is resilient and can overcome the present challenges. So I'd rather say that multilateralism is at a crossroads in view of the many challenges facing the international community that require cooperation on a global scale on one hand, and in view also of the tectonic geopolitical shifts in the distribution of power, be it military, economic, or diplomatic. Now, as Luis Fernandez was mentioning, this has not been made easier by the coronavirus pandemic. Secretary General Antonio Guterres has spoken of 4 horsemen of the apocalypse confronting the United Nations today. Rising tension among the larger powers, climate change, rising inequality, and the dark side of technological advances, to which one must add a 5th horseman that wasn't even foreseen in the Bible, the pandemic itself. As former Australian Prime Minister, my friend Kevin Rudd stated recently, the UN has proved its resilience and longevity at 75 years. But this should not lead us to believe that it can regenerate itself automatically. It's possible to say that the UN has been responding to certain challenges with foresight, as was the case in the 2015 General Assembly with the consensus adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. In the human rights field as well, the Human Rights Commission has benefited from new procedures such as the Universal Periodic Review and a strengthened mandate. At the same time, the Trump years placed considerable stress on the system as a whole, with Washington's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and the WHO providing some examples of this withdrawal. It seems that with the new US administration under President Biden, an opportunity may be at hand for more constructive multilateralism. When we look at the 3 pillars of UN activity, peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights, it is the first, I believe, namely peace and security, that there seems to be the most obvious deficit when it comes for this need for regeneration of which Kevin Rudd speaks. Not only in terms of updating governance mechanisms, Security Council reform, which I have in mind, but also with regard to concepts and toolboxes, which is a subject that brings us together today or tonight for us in Cairo. So it is in this context that today's discussion on peace operations can provide insights and guidelines for future action based on a critique of recent developments and with an eye on the new geopolitical realities of multipolarity. Having made these introductory remarks, I'd like to introduce a few thoughts and address them to this extremely distinguished group of panelists today. Let me just introduce our specific topic by reminding ourselves that even before the COVID pandemic, the Blue Helmets faced a period of retrenchment and budgetary constraints. Mission mandates have undergone many transformations, from the recent robust turn to the incorporation of stabilization mandates grounded in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism doctrine, changes that are taking place at a crossroads of economic downturn and geopolitical realignment. Today, I think what we would like to do is, with the highly qualified expertise in this discussion, to look at the effects of transformations in mission mandates for troop contributing countries, as well as for the populations on the ground, because this is what ultimately peace operations are for. Concurrently, we should try to examine what is the place of the so-called global South in these trends, and how is the emergence of a more multipolar dynamics shaping Security Council debates. So starting with the first issue that I'd like to outline, and I would invite in particular Kari Oslan and Matea Peter to share some thoughts on the topic that I'll try to outline. I'll start by saying that if on one hand, the Security Council has gravitated towards mandates for peace operations that reflect a disappointing lowest common denominator centered on stabilization efforts, and on the other hand, going back to a liberal peacebuilding approach with Christmas tree mandates does not seem desirable, is there a possible third way forward? Does the Secretary General's action for peacekeeping A4P provide a basis for a new consensus? Can the Peacebuilding Commission and the Peacebuilding Fund play a more consequential role in prevention and in sustaining peace, thereby even obviating the need for peace operations? And as former chairman of the Peacebuilding Commission, I am very interested in and always very comparative advantages. That I am a little bit disturbed by the idea of invoking SDG 16 in a peace operations context. I believe there's a risk here of hijacking the 2030 agenda from its sustainable development framework and inadvertently placing it in a securitized environment, which is something that we fought very hard against at Rio +20 and then in New York as we negotiated the 2030 agenda. So this is the first series of topics that I would invite comments on.
Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so yes, so firstly, thank you so much for inviting me, and Matea. I'll not speak on behalf of her, but we wrote this article together, and we are honored to join this panel tonight. Just to say, because it's night here in Oslo as well, it's 8:00 p.m. So thank you for the introduction and also for the question. And you touch directly into one of our main arguments in our article, where we do say that, or we argue that for the UN and UN peace operations to retain their relevance, they need to embrace a new peace-building agenda that acknowledges both the transboundary nature of conflict drivers and also the multipolar, not the unipolar, but the multipolar nature of the global order. And therefore, we think that we need to break with the current approach that seems to prioritize stabilization and extension of state authority, but also the part of the liberal peace-building approach that has not been particularly successful, and which has been very much a part of the unipolar era, where we've seen a very much of a top-down approach, prioritizing a securitized approach. So building on that, we do think that with COVID also putting a strain on the economic budget in each and every member state of the UN, this will, we do see the start of a economic recession everywhere, and this will put strain on the UN's budget, meaning that we have to to prioritize much more. And we are arguing that one of the main topics to prioritize on is the rule of law, but also to really take into account what we have known for long, namely that sustainability is a problem. Therefore, bottom-up initiatives need to be embraced, and there needs to be a connection between the global and the local, empowering the local initiatives so that it is owned by those who live through it. And we are also arguing that this could be well connected with the A4P and the SDG goal 16, of course, because it is much more acceptable to a larger number of actors globally. But I will not take more space. I will perhaps ask Matea whether you would like to jump in and add something on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kari. Matea, could you please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so very much for inviting me. It is very bright here, but I guarantee you that it's evening as well. We're quite up north too. But I'm excited to be on this panel, of course, and it's great seeing people that were involved in the special issue as well. So just following on from sort of what Kari was saying, and sort of from the provocation on whether we might be pushing sort of a securitized development agenda in our idea. So what Kari and we kind of started, the paper started with kind of a bit of an interesting puzzle. And so this is something that both of us have been working for a very long time on, whether in this era of sort of great power competition, sort of everybody pushing or pulling in each direction, you can actually have peace building. Given sort of how peacekeeping operations have essentially been to a large extent reduced to sort of this lowest common denominator things, lowest common denominator idea. And so one thing that we came up with and sort of started arguing through it is, and we think that it's actually a desirable peace building agenda, both for local actors, but is also a feasible peace building agenda to an extent, is to do sort of like a limited version of what we used to have as peace building, which would focus on rule of law and accountability of domestic institutions in particular. If we are sort of supporting these domestic institutions, there's a need to hold them accountable as well. And this is something that especially non-great powers, right? So sort of smaller, medium powers, and also powers from sort of the global south and global north do actually have some consensus around, because we see these goals being promoted both as part of SDGs and action for peacekeeping. In terms of whether that would actually hijack the SDG agenda by itself, I genuinely think not. I think there is a space for peace building within peacekeeping. So our plan and sort of our argument was that the fact that SDGs have sustainable development goals have such a broad consensus, and they do involve goals such as rule of law in them, shows that this is something that could be incorporated in peacekeeping. And so as academics, right, we would probably call it SDGs. Security Council probably would not call it security development goals. In terms of the action for peacekeeping, whether it's an appropriate path forward, it's one of those tricky things, because the things that are on action for peacekeeping they're very difficult to disagree with, right? So there are things that a lot of us, sort of both in policy and academia, have been saying that are needed in peacekeeping, that such a reforms were needed. Member states agree to them, so it makes sense. But if you think about it, action for peacekeeping is a long wish list of things. And so our question, I guess, in this particular paper and sort of where it touches on, we don't address it in the paper, is that we think that some of those things need to be prioritized. And holding institutions, which we are propping up through peacekeeping today, and I'm thinking sort of especially of these sort of stabilization, counterinsurgency missions that we're seeing, where we're supporting local governments, we then need to hold those local governments accountable. And I think that there is a space for peacekeeping in that area. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Can I just go back with a little piece of my question that I would be interested in hearing from both of you? Do you see any role for the Peacebuilding Commission, an enhanced role for the Peacebuilding Commission in your kind of vision, where rule of law and accountability would come center stage in, let's say, the promotion of peace and security, generally speaking?
I would say definitely yes. I think it's not just a role of Peacebuilding Commission, it's also a role of other sort of regional organizations or sort of other multilateral institutions in exactly this agenda. I think for me, the biggest question is what is reasonable to expect that the Security Council will mandate as part of peacekeeping in terms of a peace building agenda, given that you kind of have to balance both the great power politics and, our ambition was to sort of sneak in some of the peace building agenda so that those early steps can actually start before sort of the Peace Building Commission or regional organizations or other multilateral institutions take over. But yes, I do think that Peace Building Commission has a great role to play in sort of the next steps that follow the peacekeeping operations.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I support that. Sorry.
Please carry on.
No, just to say that I fully support that. I don't have anything to add, but I think it is extremely important to have a strong focus on the financing mechanisms. I mean, we are too short-sighted, I think, generally, as for what we want to achieve. Thanks.
Thanks for reminding us of the financing aspect. Well, we can always come back to some of these topics, but let me pass on to the second series of issues that I'd like to raise. And these were initially mentioned in a paper by Cedric, who is not with us tonight. So I wonder if maybe Connor Foley may wish to address them, or Kai Kenkel, or others. In fact, it starts with the idea that there may be a mismatch between UN doctrine, which only exceptionally envisions the use of force by peacekeepers, as in the Force Intervention Brigade in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example, and African stability operations, which seem to fall under what in the UN would be considered a peace of enforcement umbrella. Is there scope for promoting a common vocabulary between the UN and the African Union when it comes to planning, managing, commanding, and evaluating the effectiveness of peace operations? And not unrelated to this question is the one of the relationship between the UN and NATO. Of course, here, what comes to my mind is not necessarily what NATO has undertaken as peacekeeping, but as military intervention per se in Libya. I think there's a widely shared view that NATO interpreted its mandate in Libya to protect civilians as green light for undertaking regime change. And we are all living with the disastrous consequences of that interpretation, or maybe would say misinterpretation. So shouldn't there be an effort at establishing procedures to prevent these kinds of scenarios from happening in the future? And I think I see a parallel between the African Union UN issue and this other issue, in the sense that these are regional organizations, or in the case of NATO, a defense alliance with a regional scope, that are supposedly acting under the Chapter 8 philosophy, but that may be actually extrapolating the original vision for Chapter 8. So I guess we could call it a little bit of a provocation as well. Connor, would you like to comment?
Sure. Yeah. We're chatting between each other and saying, Paul, if it's acceptable to you, I can talk a little bit about use of force, rule of law issues related to both the UN and NATO, and if I could leave the question of relationship with the African Union to yourself, if that's okay. Just to contextualize, although I'm based at PUC-Rio, I'm actually much more of an activist than an academic. I spent most of my professional life involved in human rights and humanitarian work. In the 1990s, I worked at Amnesty International and had responsibility for the section's work on impunity during the Pinochet case and the ICC negotiations. And I first went to the field, to Kosovo, during NATO's humanitarian intervention in 1999. I was then seconded to UNHCR, and I spent 10 years working in the field for UN and other humanitarian organizations. And that coincided with the first protection of civilians mandate that the UN issued for the mission in Sierra Leone in 1999, and also the Secretary General's bulletin on the applicability of international humanitarian law in UN peace operations. And in that 10 years, it was very much seen as standard that the UN was given Chapter 7 authority to its missions to protect civilians, and that was the jus ad bellum came from Chapter 7 of the Charter, and the jus in bello was provided by international humanitarian law, i.e. that UN peacekeeping soldiers had authority to take part in a conflict to protect people, which was always problematic because the three core principles of peacekeeping, non-use of force, impartiality, and also minimum use of force except in defense of the mandate, impartiality and consent of the parties, clearly mitigates against participating in armed conflict. And the result was confusion. So in the 10 years I was in the field, the UN time and time again failed to protect civilians. I worked in most conflicts in the world in that 10-year period up until 2009, when I ended up in Sri Lanka during the genocide, and also discovered I was about to become a father. So that marked the end of my period as an activist in the field. And I started working as a consultant. And one of the first jobs I did was for the Department of Peacekeeping Operations on specifically how the UN could be better at protecting civilians. And one of the points that I encountered, probably because I come from a human rights background, is a strangeness as to why the UN felt that the rules relating to or governing the use of force would be based in the rules of armed conflict, international humanitarian law. Why didn't peacekeepers feel that when they used force, it should be regulated by international human rights law, which is much more the law that's related to law enforcement agencies? I mean, a police officer has a right and a duty to protect people using force, potentially even lethal force. But that's quite different to IHL, to when a soldier becomes part of a conflict. And I think the UN has been caught in a kind of tension between that. Should it be bound by a warfighting paradigm, the Force Intervention Brigade, the IHL paradigm, or should it be, or should it see itself more as operating within an international human rights law paradigm, that of the protection of civilians, as is generally understood? I think two things have now made that problem less. One is that NATO, which clearly is a warfighting organization, has generally accepted that international human rights law can be applied concurrently with international humanitarian law and extraterritorially. So NATO has increasingly adopted civilian harm mitigation practices based on its experiences in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and also based on cases taken under international human rights law, the European Court of Human Rights, against the UK, against the Dutch government, against others, saying that actually, when in the treatment of prisoners, in the use of force, in investigation, deaths in custody, the NATO actually has to apply international human rights law. We have a problem, which is how we apply international human rights law to the UN, because the UN is not a party to international human rights treaties, but nor is it a party to international humanitarian treaties. So I think there is a solution to that problem. And civilian harm mitigation practices, which include tracking, the right to remedy, acknowledging that when military operations take place, they will have consequences on the rights of civilians, increasingly mean you can apply the two concurrently. But there is a problem, which is how we can apply that international human rights law paradigm to the UN, given the structure of the Charter, immunities, and some kind of perhaps operational resistance. Although I think that's breaking down. I think the UN is increasingly recognizing that human rights law can be applied to it. At the same time, and I'll finish on this point though, the UN is winding down its peace operations, I mean, quite visibly. It hasn't opened any new operations since 2014. It's in the process of transitioning out of most of its large peace operations. A few remain, but there's only now 7 which have POC mandates. And increasingly, the UN is seeing that it needs to capacitate state institutions, rule of law, justice systems, policing mechanisms, as Matteo and Carrie have mentioned. So the UN is seeing that it has the best way for it to protect civilians is to capacitate state institutions. And that begs the final question: if the UN has a responsibility to protect civilians under international law, at what point does that responsibility stop when it's transitioning out of a peace operation? At the moment when the last peacekeeping soldier leaves, the moment when the Chapter 7 mandate ends, and who does it hand over to? What's the role of the UN country team? What's the role of the special political mission that succeeds it? And what are the responsibilities the UN has under international law in those transitions? So I'll leave it at that and hand over to Paul.
Well, thank you. You took us into a kind of related field that is quite fascinating and raise a whole host of other questions. I am reminded of the Brazilian proposal on responsibility while protecting, which I think is quite relevant in discussing your last point, where does responsibility start and end? And is it acceptable or is it not irresponsible to cause more harm than good through whatever military means that you're employing at the time? So these remain debates that are very much alive, I must say. From my current post here in Cairo, I can tell you that at the academic level, for example, at the American University of Cairo, when they study Libya, they look very carefully at RWP. I think we don't have the expertise with us today on the question of, let's say, finding convergence between African Union mandates and the UN. So perhaps I'll pass on to the third topic that I had prepared. And it actually builds on what Connor has just mentioned. If the traditional core principles guiding peace operations with respect to consent, impartiality, and minimum use of force, are they still valid, or should we consider that they no longer are adequate to meet current challenges? Or else, in the contrary, does the UN become less effective and lose credibility when it departs from these core principles? This was very much a concern back in the days of the peacekeeping footprint in the former Yugoslavia, where the expression mission creep used to come up. And I believe that, among others, Samantha Power has written quite extensively on that. So should we be looking at a new pragmatism involving, on one hand, respect for principles that have demonstrated their validity in the past, but also an open mind towards innovation where appropriate? What are possible innovative ideas that do not involve militarization and more robust missions in this regard? And I wonder if Katharina Coleman and Paul Williams would like to address this discussion.
Sure, thank you, Ambassador. I chatted with Katya beforehand, and I was going to take first stab, but actually I would just lead off with where Connor finished first, actually, with the, what happens to the responsibility in a transition. And my initial answer to Connor's question there is we should all look very closely at UNAMID in Darfur and the transition that's been happening over the last year or so now, because precisely as Connor mentioned, you've had there the transition of a UN multidimensional mission with a POC mandate when there was severe controversy over whether the POC dimension had actually been, implemented and sustained before the mission was drawn down. You had a change of government, obviously, from a military dictatorship under Bashir to a who knows what exactly coming next. We had soldiers departing from the team sites, leaving police and civilian peacekeepers. We've seen, I think, sadly, if my numbers are correct, about 7 out of 10 of those sites that have been handed over by the military peacekeepers in UNAMID were then looted and basically, taken over by forces in Darfur that weren't supposed to. And so I think that's a really good case study for Connor's questions there, that we look at then UNITAM's now the new peacebuilding and special political mission. But it's very difficult, and I think they are working out the answers to these questions in real time, is my sense. There's no sort of obvious blueprint for that. And I'm going to abuse myself as well, just on I can't stop myself on the African Union question. It's something that I've studied for a long time. So just on the ambassador's point there, I don't think there's any reason we're going to get a shared vocabulary or agreement between the UN and the AU on this, and that's for two reasons. One, because I don't think there's any real consensus over even what a peace operation means. I think if you look at the academic literature, certainly if you go beyond what the Blue Helmets are doing, people agree that UN Blue Helmet missions count as peace operations. But when you start looking at other military and policing activities conducted by regional organizations or coalitions of state, there's an alive, and ongoing debate about where exactly the boundaries of peace operations lie in general. So I think that's the first structural point, is that we see divergent definitions across the board here in academia and in policy. And then secondly, specifically on the AU and the UN, I think, no, there's different philosophies here at play. The principles that Connor mentioned of the UN Blue Helmets are not the same foundation principles that the African Union has for what it calls peace support operations. And the key differences here are to do with force and impartiality, I would say, right? The AU defines a peace support operation as potentially including a collective security operation, right? Peace enforcement, basically war fighting against designated enemies. And the AU has no problem with that. We've seen it most, in its extended form, fighting al-Shabaab under the Amisom mission in Somalia, but we've also seen it elsewhere in the early days of the missions in Central African Republic and in Mali. And the Comoros was the other one there. And so on force, there's a difference. And also the AU on paper includes in that definition of PSOs, what it calls Article 4H of its Constitutive Act is a potential military intervention in cases of what it calls grave circumstances, genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And although there's never been an actual deployment invoking Article 4H, that is a scenario that the African Standby Force and the AU's peace support operations envisage. And that obviously is out of the realms of what a UN peacekeeping operation would ever undertake. And then that leads into impartiality. Yeah, I think the African Union has had absolutely no problem taking government sides against rebels. And so whereas it's a bit of a, still, as Connor mentioned, it's a difficult balancing act to perform in terms of us stretching the UN's definition of impartiality to be sort of pro-state and anti-rebel and still be impartial. But the African Union has no real problem with that. So that's why I think they're different. And I think I'll stop there and hand over to Katja for your other questions.
Thanks very much. Thanks for addressing the former question and also bringing us into the conversation on this new topic. Please, Katharina.
Thank you. And thank you to the organizers for having me, and thank you, Ambassador, for managing us so well. I think leading on from where other speakers were, part of where Paul and my paper started as well was to think about, well, what really is in crisis? There's clearly been a decline in the resources available for peacekeeping, including in the UN. It's not at all clear that peace operations as such will disappear. There's a lot of good reasons for them to stay and a lot of interests involved in having them. What we do see, I think, is a debate about what exactly peacekeeping or peace operations are, which is where Paul was and where Connor was just earlier. And those debates, I think, are happening in different forums, which raises these questions about, on the one hand, there's a debate, not just amongst academics, but within the UN. And of course, these papers have touched on it, and A4P touches on it, about what peacekeeping or peace operations are within the UN. There's similar kinds of evolving conversations within regional organizations. And then there's the question about how these organizations coordinate together in terms of both cooperating either successively one after the other or in the field if there's two operations. This stretching of the definition of what peacekeeping is or what peace operations is I think where the politics currently is. And it's not necessarily clear that there will be a single definition of it, but what that then does raise is the question of how these different definitions fit together. And as Paul pointed to, questions about impartiality or questions also around how stabilization happens, how civilians are protected, are part of that conversation.
Well, I think this is one of the convergences we are leading towards, the absence of a consensus and different doctrines emerging, and perhaps a need to better understand what actually promotes peace in the even the need to define what we are searching for in terms of peace, whether it's just defeating militias or groups or something that goes a little bit beyond. But this leads us to the next topic, where I would invite Professor Kai Kinkel's views. His paper has looked at the fact that, well, most troop contributing countries being located in the global south, it seems that stabilization mandates, as opposed to liberal peace building ones, may be producing more negative than positive effects domestically, and encouraging authoritarian tendencies. In his paper, he uses Brazil as illustration of this. And indeed, there was a recent interview in the Brazilian media by a retired colonel that seemed to support Professor Kenkel's views. Can a corrective course of action be envisaged? Perhaps, for example, through encouraging more participation in peace operations by troops from more consolidated democracies? Or are we witnessing a pattern that is here to stay with us in spite of the negative trends? Kai, you have the floor.
Thanks very much for your question, Ambassador. Let me just begin by thanking all of you in the panel for being here today. It's a great pleasure to be able to bring so much expertise to an event that we're hosting down here in Rio. I also want to take up very briefly an idea that I've seen an increasing number of my colleagues do here in Brazil, which is to thank my wife for making my participation here possible, and pretty much my participation in anything since this pandemic has started. Basically, this question, it inverts the flow a little bit of what we've been talking about, right? We've been talking about effects on peacekeeping, coming, external shocks to peacekeeping, and now we're sort of switching around to what the effect of participating in peacekeeping is on those who are doing it, right? And interestingly, still sort of somewhat further away from what the effects on the local population are. So basically, what the article that I wrote centers on, and sort of responds to the question as well, is this idea, this sort of hypothesis that's come about that Philip Cunliffe has termed the diversionary peace, which is the idea that states from consolidating democracies can enter into peace operations, predominantly, as it were, liberal peace building operations, and kind of by some demonstration effect, by being surrounded by troops from northern states or consolidated democracies, sort of learn good civilian control, right? And essentially, and then also sort of signal progress in their own democratization processes by highlighting their participation in these missions. And basically that hypothesis is based on two elements. It's based on, first of all, a strong northern presence in these operations, sort of as a demonstration effect. And the second one is the fact that these missions have, at least discursively, sort of a people-centered mandate, right? And so the liberal peace building, for all its foibles, at least discursively, at least in its efforts, has the local population and its well-being as the referent object, as it were. So what has happened, this is at least my argument, with the move to stabilization, is that we have a fundamental switch in referent object in these stabilization missions from the liberal peace paradigm, where it's no longer local populations' well-being in first place, but rather host government interests and also, to an extent, interveners' interests, as it were. So what we see there is, in this shift of referent object, we're removing an important element of the demonstration effect, right? We're engaging in much more of a militarized kind of view of mission objectives. We're not, if we are putting sort of local population interests first, it's by way of reinforcing the host state's ability to provide that for them. Another kind of nefarious element of this is that much of what we see in the doctrine that underpins stabilization are things that we know well in the global south, in Latin America, for example, counterterrorism doctrine, counterinsurgency doctrine, which is something that we experienced domestically in Latin America during the years of military dictatorships. So what happens there is that, I wouldn't say necessarily, or I don't say in the piece either, that participation in stabilization missions is necessarily negative for civil control at home. What I do say is it reinforces existing dynamics. So if you have a military establishment that has consolidated up to a certain point, kind of past that critical point, it can reinforce very much positive civilian control. If you have a military establishment that's looking for more freedom from the shackles of civilian oversight, it can also provide that, particularly in areas where we, as we do in Brazil to a certain extent, have kind of voluntarily weak civilian oversight over and a kind of a military, very strong military influence over what happens inside peace operations in our contingents, right? So it can go either way, but it's certainly sort of the demonstration effect is gone, and it can end up having nefarious effects. And I think one point that's important to underline is that it's very difficult to speak of sort of one global South, right? In Latin America, perhaps, or at least in the Brazilian view that's shared, by a lot of our neighbors, it's quite different from what's happening with a lot of the troop contributors on the African continent. In fact, inside the African Union, you have countries with, incomplete civilian control that are kind of deriving themselves, sort of asking for stabilization missions, right? There are players on the African continent that are very much in favor of a strong use of force and stabilization missions. So that's very different from the view. So it's kind of a more development focused, not minimum use of force view that we might develop culturally in Latin America. So it's kind of difficult to talk about one global South. So again, sort of what we see in terms of the feedback in the Brazilian case is there's been quite a lot of academic literature on this, both in Brazil and outside, as we see sort of this feedback from Haiti into domestic public security missions, right? Where we see kind of an increasing involvement of the armed forces in policing missions in Rio de Janeiro, in the favelas, and some other places that have militarized that response. And that hasn't always been necessarily a good thing for the people in those favelas, right? It's kind of put a focus more on repression again. And that is in various different ways sort of an offshoot of some of the dynamics that have happened inside MINUSTA that do come from its stabilization characteristics. To touch on the question of very briefly on of corrective measures for this and how it can be done, right? I don't think our salvation, as it would in diversionary peace theory, from this comes from more northern participation. I think it comes from better practices in the global South TCCs, right? So I think if we are going to prevent some of the more nefarious effects from happening of this, I think it does have to do with supporting those ongoing processes in some of the consolidating democracies through various types of norm diffusion, as it were, or policy assistance in that sense, rather than always sort of seeing northern states as being this kind of great source of a demonstration effect.
I tend to agree with that because in many ways, I find that the North may have inadvertently or not, I'm not sure, encouraged the current trends towards stabilization and placing a premium on repressive UN peacekeeping without really caring all that much about these secondary effects back home that you very rightly raised, especially in the case of Brazil. Well, I think we've had an initial round. Have I called on all participants to share some views? I think I have, right, at this point. And let's see, how much time have we taken so far? Yeah. So I had just thought of putting a few more provocative ideas on the table, and wonder if any of you would like to jump in. Is it really acceptable to continue having these permanent members as pen holders of Security Council resolutions that relate to their former colonies as the British with some of the English-speaking countries in Africa, or France with French-speaking countries in Africa, and so on, with very limited scope for non-permanent members to play a leadership role when it comes to drafting resolutions and promoting, let's say, language that will subsequently, in most cases, become a consensus. I wonder if any of you have any views on that. Or it leaves you indifferent. I'll tell you one thing, it doesn't leave me indifferent at all. I think it's completely anachronistic, and it surprises me that not more people talk about it. I participated here at the Aswan Forum, which is a regional African forum the Egyptians organized when they were in the chairmanship of the African Union. And I was happy at least to get a lot of support from former Algerian Foreign Minister Ramtan Lamamra, who was in charge of peace and security in the African Union. So since I see Connor Foley coming into the screen, I'll wait for your comments on this.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And at the risk of embarrassing you, I'd highlight 2 points that you played a crucial role in your capacity as Foreign Minister under a previous Brazilian government. First, the RWP, which I think was one of the most innovative and useful and creative approach to this whole dilemma about when force can be used for protective purposes and how it can be used given the global inequalities that exist. And secondly, the debate about UN Security Council reform. And in particular, I'm reminded of a seminar in which you chaired, when we talked about the necessity, firstly, of course, of expanding the Security Council, expanding the permanent membership of the Security Council, but also, and I think this was the crucial suggestion, that the idea that the Security Council could be expanded with the addition of, for example, Brazil, India, Germany, and Japan, which is just kind of logical in terms of looking at global things. And of course, now there may well soon be a vacancy coming up when the United Kingdom dissolves. So we can perhaps take them up, but also that should be done without a veto, that the new Security Council members should come on without a veto. And I think that's crucial, because the veto is one of the worst things that exists in the UN and in international law and international relations. There is so little we can do until we get rid of the UN Security Council veto that the 5 permanent members have. It's crucial because the Security Council is so powerful in international law, because UN Charter law takes precedence over all other international conventions and treaties, including human rights treaties, including humanitarian treaties. So when the Security Council says something is a threat to civilians, or is international terrorism, or is, whenever the Security Council defines something as a threat to international security, it becomes a threat to international security. And to take Paul's point about the AU has a far wider context of the need for Article 4H interventions to protect civilians. The Security Council doesn't do it because it doesn't need to do it. It can just simply say, this is a threat to international security. And once the 5 members of the Security Council, who were 5 countries chosen at random on the basis of who won the Second World War, then they have that power. And as you say, the pen holders all come from the north. It's France, it's the United States, it's the United Kingdom. But the troop contributing countries, almost all, come from the global south. And so the soldiers who are expected to put their lives on the line to protect these Christmas tree mandates or these crazy stabilization doctrines or whatever a UN Security Council member comes up with that particular week, are having to do so on the basis of not being represented where the decisions get made. And frankly, they don't do a good job. And although, I mean, I was just looking at the statistics, in UN peacekeeping virtually never use force to protect civilians. They go out on patrol, but they stay in their lorries. They simply, or their jeeps, they simply drive past villages. They stay in urban areas. They don't go out at night. They don't put foot patrols into rural areas. They don't talk to civilians. They don't listen to civilians. They don't proactively attempt to protect civilians. and instead they prioritize themselves on managing upwards to a Security Council dominated by an entirely unrepresentative global clique. So I would overwhelmingly endorse everything you're saying, and congratulate the work that you did for bringing that day. We could almost feel it 10 years ago that we were getting closer to it, but sadly the world has gone back a few paces since then. But perhaps we can reconvene and go forward again.
Well, thank you, and you have not embarrassed me. You have, on the contrary, made me very happy. We are starting to get some questions from the viewers, and the first question I received, I'm not sure I understand it completely, but I will read it out. How would we keep international forces from directly interfering in states now that local institutions have a bigger part on peace building? Is it a fact that local institutions are playing a bigger part on peace building? Is this something desirable that precisely the United Nations can maybe help achieve? Would anyone like to contribute? Maybe help to clarify what the question seems to imply? I think I need a volunteer now. Perhaps one of the ladies. Because we have almost gender balance today, by the way. Good thing. Katharina.
Sure, and I see Kari also has her hand up, so maybe I'll start and feel free to join in. I mean, I think part of this rides a lot on, what we mean by the international forces and the local institutions. I mean, there is a mandating process, of course, and then, as was mentioned, I mean, in cases like Libya, there's worries about how that mandate gets implemented. The local institutions, I think, opens a really interesting but also very important kind of debate, because, of course, just as the international isn't a single entity, the local isn't necessarily either. And precisely which local institutions are enabled turns a lot on how peace building is done. And that ultimately also raises questions about which local actors peacekeepers decide to interact with. I think it is true that there's a greater awareness in the UN and elsewhere that a fully top-down approach to simply impose a peace is not going to be effective, that there has to be local ownership or local buy-in, awareness of local circumstances. But that raises its own sets of questions about who gets to speak for the local, who those local actors are, and how they can be included.
Well, that was really an excellent reply, and I think you approach this question from the right perspective. What do we mean exactly in the complexities? Kari, would you like to add something?
Perhaps just a few words. I think it is the case that there is currently a kind of window of opportunity with more actors arguing and advocating for local players to play a stronger role. I think we have a long way to go still. As for international actors intervening, I mean, that is kind of a matter of fact. Whether it's desirable or not, I will not say anything about that. But I think this touched upon something else, which a colleague of mine, he calls this the fragility dilemma, Morten Bøos at NUPI, and which has to do with fragile states, for instance, in the Sahel, that are in dire need of external assistance, but at the same time have very limited absorption capacity and are governed by regimes who kind of dictate the terms and upon which external actors rely. So in that sense, these regimes have a lot I mean, they can dictate the terms as for what is happening. But having this dilemma on the one hand, at the same time, you have what you could call a divergence between the kind of local communities, the people writ large, and the state, the regime, and the international actors on the other hand, where what is conceived as the main security concern doesn't necessarily converge. So this is very complex, and I think I'll leave it at that. Just also to add, if I may, I think your point, Ambassador, as for the P5 being pen holders on former colonies, I think it's an excellent point. And Norway, as you know, probably is in the Security Council now as a non-permanent member. And I think this is something, at least I will whisper in their ears that they should promote. I think I'm sure you have your channels where this could be promoted in a different way, but I think it is an excellent point. Thanks.
Thank you. No, and of course it ties in with the issue of reform of Security Council, because when you only come in at very, let's say, distant intervals in time, you don't acquire the expertise that the P5 have, you know,
Exactly.
kind of the memory, the files, and everything else. You're a little bit helpless and cornered into a role of passivity that I think is undesirable from, let's say, a systemic point of view.
Yeah, indeed.
But listening to both of you, I was also reminded of, we didn't really talk too much about prevention, even though the current Secretary General places a lot of emphasis on prevention rather than remedying situations that have already gotten out of hand. And one interesting thought that has come out, I believe Oscar Taranco has something to do with it in the PBSO, the Peacebuilding Support Office, but also the Aswan Forum that I have followed here in Egypt, is prevention as a sovereignty enhancer. So rather than selling the idea of prevention as undue interference that will weaken states or expose them even to their own public opinion as not having been able to handle internal challenges that could degenerate into a peacekeeping or instability or a crisis of some degree, inverting this reasoning and presenting prevention as something that, no, will actually strengthen you as a sovereign nation and local institutions, hopefully in a positive way. Although this is also a complex debate because it could also strengthen in a authoritarian kind of way. I have two more questions here. One touches on the issue of refugee protection by UN activity, and I suppose in the context of peacekeepers. And so I would invite comments on this issue of refugees, which have been, the number of refugees, as we know, have been growing very significantly as a result of unresolved conflict all over the place, here in the Eastern Mediterranean, for sure. There seems to be let's say, a readiness or a greater willingness to go into the robust peace operations mode or even military intervention mode that very often generates instability and provokes flows of refugees. Much greater readiness on the part of some powerful UN members to do that than to accept refugees knocking at their doors after such policies that have not produced the desired results. Is there a way out of this? And who would like to contribute a thought? Mateja, you have raised your hand. Please.
Great. So I did a physical hand raise because I thought it was going to be easier. I think this question, it's a really super question because it also shows how limited the tool of peacekeeping is, right? Because peacekeeping operations require a consent of the host state, which means that when there are sort of human spills, right, sort of refugees going across border, peace operations have no control over sort of providing protection further down the line. And how, I think it also shows how we need to sort of think of peacekeeping as just only kind of one tool in the toolbox that we have in terms of sort of addressing collective security issues, and that it might be a tool that is not kind of the most appropriate for a lot of the contemporary conflicts that we're dealing with, which are transboundary, which sort of involve human flows and sort of things like that. At the same time, and this is where I'm going to set up Paul, because Paul's going to know a lot more on sort of the both missions that I'm talking about. Peacekeepers do actually play a role when it comes to internally displaced people, and sort of are mandated in a lot of cases to protect civilians in those cases. So based on my sort of understanding, and I'm not an expert on either South Sudan or the mission in Darfur, this kind of protection is very limited. And sort of looking at these sites, it's not about physical protection anymore. So peacekeepers play extremely limited roles when it comes to sort of the kind of protection that we think that they should provide. So I know myself, when I talk to students and you kind of say protection of civilians, they literally think that there's a soldier protecting civilians in these contexts because the civilians are being attacked. While most of the focus of the mission, and so it's been a couple of years since I've done sort of work in Darfur, but most of work seems to be on empowering local institutions to do this job. And then it's a question of whether the local institutions actually have both ability, but also willingness and sort of wish to do that. So I think it's an interesting thing, because especially when it comes to refugees, sort of people crossing borders into other countries, it really, like, sort of the idea of peacekeeping really shows sort of how limited this sort of tool is in addressing sort of the kind of concerns that we have today.
Yes, thank you very much for a very eloquent reply. And Paul, would you like to add something? Your name was mentioned in this context.
No, not here, but I'll say something about evaluation of peace operations in the next question, but nothing for that.
Okay. Well, Jean-Baptiste Vieira is asking a very kind of broad question. What is the main difficulty for UN peace operations today? Is it possible one main difficulty or one set of main difficulties? Are the difficulties so wide in scope that it would take a very long discussion to come to an understanding of what the difficulties are? Certainly, I think there are financial difficulties, there are difficulties regarding the conceptual framework to see what actually produces good results and what doesn't. And I see Kai Kenkel raising his hand. Would you like to help us tackle this subject? Thank you.
Actually, it was, I think, still raised from the last question, but if I can just go into that one really briefly. I think there's a question here that has to do with peace operations, maybe in their structuring, having better integration with dynamics in neighboring countries as well, sort of looking at not only the host country, but also sort of already including more in the mandates, or at least more in the Security Council's consciousness, the question of refugees, certainly, but also looking at the dynamics with regional countries. Just to, it seems to me, looking at where the largest refugee crises are, I mean, to my mind, besides Burma, which is a slightly different case, it's the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria, and Venezuela. Like, let's not forget, for the international audience, there's actually more refugees leaving Venezuela, about 25% of the population, than coming through the two routes in the Eastern Mediterranean. And these are both situations where the local population is having to face a relatively large amount of suffering due to an impasse in foreign interests going on in those two countries, right? So this has to do with the great power game that also plays out in Security Council, right, with refugees. And I think that those two issues are quite interlocked in terms of the great power politics. In terms of the greatest difficulties being faced by peace operations, I think the question, we might be able to sort of turn that question around a little bit and say sort of what are the greatest challenges to peace operations that have happened because of the current crisis? Like what are the 2 or 3 missions where we can point to concrete effects from the kind of elements of the crisis we've talked about in each of our contributions to that special issue?
Thank you, Kai, for bringing in the regional and neighboring country dimension to the refugee conversation and helping us to approach this very broad question. I have 2 requests for the floor, but Connor has asked. Would you like to?
Sure. To respond to the 2 questions, both on refugees and an evaluation of UN peace operations, and again, speaking from a personal capacity, because I worked for UNHCR, although albeit quite many years ago, and have also, my job now, my almost full-time job is to conduct evaluations. I conduct lots of evaluations with the UN and of various other humanitarian agencies working in humanitarian crisis. And to respond to a couple of points about UN mandate, I mean, it's interesting, historically, if you look at it, when the UN started using, when the Security Council started using Chapter 7 mandates to authorize protection of civilians or to authorize military interventions, it was on the basis that refugee crises first in Iraq, Kurdish refugees spilling into Southeast Turkey, and then Bosnian refugees spilling into Southern Europe, could pose a threat to international peace and security in the region through their destabilizing effect. So the Security Council got around the fact that it doesn't have a human rights mandate by saying that the human rights violations that were creating refugee flows could potentially destabilize regions. And so the first Chapter 7 mandated operations were on that basis. Having said which, of course, the protection of refugees is the responsibility of UNHCR. UNHCR is the mandated agency in the UN to protect refugees under international refugee law and human rights law. Peacekeeping soldiers can provide physical security to them, to people in displacement sites. And when I was working in northern Uganda, when I was working in South Sudan and Darfur, as soon as there was a conflict, as soon as trouble arose, people ran to either the government base or the UN base in need of physical protection. And one of the successes that we had, I think, in terms of POC was that troops with UN peacekeeping troops with a POC mandate did feel obligated to physically protect. I mean, there were soldiers standing outside IDP camps with guns in South Sudan and in Darfur. Sometimes not very effectively. I mean, that was one of the problems. Many times in the last couple of decades, IDP sites have been overrun and troops have failed to exercise their protective responsibilities. But I think there is and we shouldn't confuse physical protection, which is something that peacekeeping soldiers have a mandate to do, with protection under refugee law, which can include protection for people who are internally displaced and living in IDP camps, with the job of a peace operation. A peace operation is not there to protect the individual, to provide individual legal protection to refugees or IDPs. And just to finish on how do we evaluate UN peace operations, and as I said, the UN conducts many evaluations. There is no shortage. We have a machine of making evaluations. But to me, the most important way I would evaluate the effectiveness of a peace operation is actually its effectiveness in helping to resolve a conflict. If it can do that, that's great. in transitioning out of the peace operation to something more stable. And we've seen some successes and also a lot of failures. Paul mentioned Darfur. I was in Haiti just before the lockdown, and the mandate, the transition there is also not going very smoothly. So there's and here, of course, the Peacebuilding Commission is absolutely critical. I mean, support for the Peacebuilding Commission is a crucial part of any successful transition. But so we can measure, or we can evaluate crudely, has a peace operation been successful? Well, did it help to resolve the conflict? Did it transition out and leave a stable situation or stable state behind that was respected, that had that could pass the tests of justice, of rule of law, of DDR, and so on? And finally, I think we also do continue to evaluate peacekeeping missions by their protection of civilian capacity. I mean, clearly, the worst peacekeeping missions ever in UN history were in Bosnia and in Rwanda, because peacekeeping troops stood by while civilians were massacred in genocides. And I think for all the criticisms that we have of MONUSCO or UNAMID or the other missions, you know, they have, by and large, not necessarily particularly well always, but the presence of peacekeeping soldiers does provide some reassurance to local populations. And peacekeeping soldiers do understand they do have some duty to provide protection to civilians within their capabilities when the host state can't. So I think that's how I would evaluate the effectiveness of a peacekeeping operation in terms of conflict prevention, transition, and protection of civilians.
Yes, I was glad that you brought in the Peacebuilding Commission again. Would you be ready to give examples of effective peacekeeping operations in, let's say, 2 or 3 cases?
I could, yes. I mean, I would say that by and large, Côte d'Ivoire, I think Unoki was successful in the transition. I think when it launched a protection of civilians operation during that transition period, which was extremely tense, and thousands of civilians' lives were saved, I think, because of that. I think in South Sudan, the establishment of the POC sites was, again, an important initiative. Civilians were running towards the sites and trying to climb over the barbed wire. The troops could have stopped them, or they could have helped them, and they chose to help them. And again, I think thousands of civilians' lives were saved by that. I think MONUSCO in the DRC, some of their initiatives, the establishment of joint protection teams, the human rights due diligence policy, I think there's lots of good practices that we can get from MONUSCO, as well as some terrible practices. I think opinions are quite mixed on the Force Intervention Brigade. I was in Goma when the M23 were advancing on it, so I have some sympathy for the decision to deploy quite robustly with the Force Intervention Brigade. But I don't think that UN peacekeeping troops should enter conflicts. I think to move from peacekeeping to warfighting is a disaster. The UN's not structured to do it, and whatever short-term gains you get, the long-term you compromise independence, neutrality, impartiality, peacekeeping, and so on. I'll leave it there. I've actually just finished, I wrote an evaluation for OHCHR on transitions, and there's there's a chapter on good practices there that I'd be very happy to share with people. So I think there are good practices. And one of them is actually the Peacebuilding Commission. And it's a huge problem, because the mission closes and there's a financial cliff, the donors stop giving money. And actually that's the real time you want to increase the money. You want to increase the state building capacity, the rule of law programs, the fair trials monitoring, et cetera, because that's in that transition. You want the state to assume responsibility for protecting its own citizens, but in fact the opposite happens, and the money disappears, and often there's virtually nothing left. And then we have there's so many countries I could list where we haven't had successes, but I'll leave it there.
Those examples are very helpful. And now I sometimes describe the submission of a situation to the Security Council as placing that conflict or crisis in the intensive care unit and the PBC as a rehabilitation center. You know, once you leave the intensive care, which is what we are aiming for, you can't just abandon a certain country or situation, and it needs a kind of follow-up. And the PBC potentially could play even a much bigger role. I think Paul Williams would like to come in on this topic, or
sure.
You have raised your hand, or?
Yeah, so just to follow up on what Connor was saying, basically, in that we have lots and lots of good studies now from independent sources, scholars and think tanks and elsewhere, that prove, I think, overwhelmingly that blue helmet missions, if we just focus on those for the moment, they overwhelmingly make really bad situations a bit better. And they make them a bit better in a number of ways. They generally reduce the number of battlefield, battle-related deaths, i.e. they stop basically belligerents fighting one another as much as they do when the blue helmets aren't around. Secondly, as Connor mentioned, the statistical evidence is that although they don't protect all civilians from every threat all the time, everywhere, they overwhelmingly show that the number of one-sided violence campaigns and fatalities is also reduced. But where they struggle is when you get into the more political and, as Connor mentioned, right, the sort of underlying drivers of conflict. And here we've got to remember there is a key distinction between peacekeepers and peacemakers, right? The blue helmets are not mediators, negotiators, diplomats that are going to end these wars. It's belligerents that end wars, not peacekeepers. Peacekeepers can make they can do damage limitation. They can reduce the negative consequences of war, as I've mentioned, but what they can't do is provide political solutions on their own. And so they're a second order sort of reactive phenomenon to the first game or primary order event, which is the relationship between the belligerents. And if peacekeeping operations can provide a breathing space and can open sort of, a higher degree of confidence and communication between the belligerent parties, then if we can put good mediators and peacemakers in tandem with our peacekeepers, we should hopefully get what we all want, which is a sustainable end to the war. And that's important. I would also add one other dimension of impact here, which is to do with the political economy of the countries that host the peace operations. There's been some good studies now. Most detail is on Liberia and the mission's sort of impact on the economy there. But we've seen positive correlations between where UN peacekeeping missions have deployed and then left, and then afterwards, generally positive forms of economic development. This is all relative, of course, right? Sierra Leone is not going to be Sweden anytime soon, but the positive effect on the economy of UN peacekeeping operations has also started to come out in some of these studies. But where, as I say, where they really struggle is the underlying drivers of war. And so, for example, I led a team that assessed the African Union mission in Somalia a couple of years ago, and we said, the three big drivers of war in Somalia are basically religious and sort of societal clan-based differences. There's good old-fashioned power politics between the elites that want power, and then there's a political economy dimension that a lot of the fighting revolves around where the money is, right? Seaports, airports, commercial routes for taxation. And Amazon peacekeepers can't do anything about those three main drivers of war, right? They can hopefully, as I said, reduce the number of battles, reduce the number of civilian casualties if they do their jobs well, but they can't fundamentally make peace if the belligerents themselves don't want to do that. And I think that's where the sort of evidence lies at the moment. And so that's in our article was about, peace operations as a potentially useful tool of policymakers. And I think now for me, the future, long term, I'm quite optimistic about the future of peace operations, because I think we have good evidence now that they are a tool that actually have some benefits. And when I look around the rest of the sort of multilateral toolbox, right, I don't see a whole range of tools with a set of sort of independent studies and evidence behind them that offer that. So my sense would be the longer we look into the future, the more politicians will actually come back to pick up this tool. Now, at the moment, we've got a Secretary General who we know doesn't really like these big multidimensional missions, and he's now got another sort of 5 years at the helm. We know we've got fighting that's going to intensify at the Security Council between the Americans and the Chinese and whoever else might chime in, which are going to mean there are difficult times ahead for UN Blue Helmet missions. But our point was, I don't think extinction is likely here. I think it's going to be, the debate will be, as you've already mentioned, what type of partnerships does the UN get engaged with in other regions of the world? And what does it do with its special political missions in the places that need them? And I suspect, although I can't prove it, I suspect we're going to be quite disappointed with what special political missions can deliver. And I think we're going to gradually sort of look to, in sort of mission creep terms, fatten them up a bit, right? Basically increase and add on to the tasks that they're trying to do, not overly militarize them. But I think they'll face the opposite problem of the overly militarized missions that we've seen. And then final thing, and then I'll shut up. If we look to like real places, there's some healthy debates going on at the moment in a number of countries around the world where no one can really think of a better option than peace operations. And this is what I mean about the second order effect. The problem is war. And the problem that drives all this is the character of war, that as it evolves, nobody, to my knowledge, has come up with a better way to help belligerents solve and end their wars than peace operations. So if you listen to the debates at the moment in Ukraine and Donbass, even in Afghanistan, in Yemen, sometimes in Syria, right? Libya, Cameroon, Mozambique, we're having an active discussion at the moment. It's back in the mix, right? What form these peace operations will take is completely up for debate. But the fact that they're being, I think, sort of debated in serious terms is really what we should try and focus on.
Thank you very much. And I think your intervention brings back also the importance of diplomacy, which I'm always happy to highlight in these debates, because you know, as effective as they may be, peace operations, they're a stopgap. They don't actually resolve conflict, and this is where you need mediation, active diplomacy, well, preventive diplomacy from relapsing back into conflict. And you also brought into the conversation another issue that I had thought of raising, which, you know, where will peacekeepers be deployed next? And I think all the places you mentioned were ones that I had thought of. Syria, hopefully, something will come out of Geir Peterson's efforts. And in Libya, a ceasefire seems to be holding, and a Berlin conference will be held soon. And at least there's a path forward with elections and perhaps a different chapter. Northern Mozambique, on the other hand, is going through a real sad and tragic episode. I hear the community of Portuguese-speaking countries will be looking at possibilities for deploying there under African Union or UN mandates, but that remains to be seen. Another question we received, I don't know if we have enough time to look at all the remaining questions, it's 9:30, but one that looks interesting is how do local politics in contributing countries affect their approach to peace operations? Would anybody like to comment on that? I think Kai Kenkel has some insights of how local politics affects the approach to peace operations in Brazil and in the global South. So would you like to add anything, Kai?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know how far we can extrapolate to other places from the Brazilian case, but I think clearly here at home, for us anyway, we see sort of, you know, two examples. We see a major switch from the Workers' Party governments from 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and to the current government. The current government has no commitment to multilateralism, quite the contrary in some ways, at least in the executive rhetoric, right? And I think that tends to influence peacekeeping participation in a way, because it is a foreign policy tool at the end of the day. At least for the Workers' Party governments, it very much was something that had objectives that went well beyond Haiti, right? The Workers' Party government had a vision for Brazil's, what they called, insertion into the world, and as an emerging power, as somebody with a larger seat at the table. And peace operations had a very concrete role to play. There was even sort of a link being made between Security Council expansion and Brazil coming sort of a 6th permanent member and being able to show that it could take on this responsibility through a mission such as MINUSTAH. So local politics and the kind of foreign policy paradigms that each government has that may or may not win an election clearly have a very strong effect on how a country sees its own projection in the world and kind of evaluates the responsibilities it has for the maintenance of public goods in that system through peacekeeping, for example. So I mean, Brazil is a very clear example when we see the difference between this kind of very active role in the Peacebuilding Commission, in MINUSTAH, in UNIFIL, and in some of the other surrounding debates, obviously R2P, RWP for Brazil that we had in for example, Minister Patriota or Ambassador Patriota's time, and what we see today with this government. So clearly they're very strong factors, and I think that holds across the board. To an extent, I mean, even in countries that have a very strong commitment to multilateralism and the United Nations as kind of one of the central pillars of their foreign policy, at the very least, you know, shifts in government will determine sort of where missions are sent, where they contribute might be different, or sort of levels of budget contributions as well. So it's clearly a very strong factor.
Yeah, I may add that today I attended a ceremony at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Cairo to celebrate Peacekeepers Day, and very visibly the Egyptian government takes great pride in having participated in peacekeeping operations since the 1960s in the Congo, and they produced a very nice short film, including showing the participation of female peacekeepers. This is something we didn't really touch upon today. The Women, Peace and Security agenda, and how that can provide some, let's say, additional a positive input into the role and the effectiveness of peacekeeping. Since we are approaching, I think, the time limit for our conversation, I'll convey 2 more questions. One is has to do with the fact that most peace operations take place in Africa today. How do the panelists evaluate the participations of our African states in peacekeeping, or of the African Union in peacekeeping? It's a rather broad question. I think we looked at the issue of different doctrines where the twain shall not meet anytime soon. They're simply too different for that, for a common vocabulary. On the other hand, I think there's appreciation that most operations taking place in Africa, certainly that is an argument that is often raised by South Africa and the others in the continent who are active defenders of 2 permanent seats for Africa. You know, if the Security Council is deliberating on their part of the world, they should have a greater say in the strategies that are adopted and in trying to orient and the debates. Would anybody like to make an assessment of African participation, African Union's role? Paul Williams and Katharina Coleman.
I'll go, Katya, you go first.
Sure. I guess just to think about, we often think of this as sort of a dichotomy, right? It's either Africa or the UN. And I think, Ambassador, your response already touched on this. There are multiple ways in which African actors are engaged in peace operations in Africa, both AU, regional operations, and UN operations. Africa has been the largest troop contributing region to UN operations for years. There are, of course, African non-permanent members on the Security Council, African local staff in peace operations are often African. So there is African participation in UN peacekeeping, and I think a demand to help shape UN peacekeeping operations at various levels, from headquarters right down to on the ground. And then there is AU peace operations and sub-regional peace operations, and a conversation about how those fit together and transition from one to the other. So I think Africa is an extremely active, African actors are extremely active in various dimensions of UN and non-UN peace operations in Africa, precisely because that is the location of so many peace operations. Paul, over to you.
Yeah, and I would just add then a couple of points to what Katja said, which was right. The two I would add is, one, there's a lot of variation amongst the member states themselves. Yeah, so it's quite heavily skewed. About 20 or so African countries provide the vast majority of those peacekeepers. And yet at the other end of the spectrum on the continent, you'll find some countries with big militaries that don't do any peacekeeping, right? If you look at Angola, Algeria, Botswana, you won't find any of their soldiers as peacekeepers at all. So there's quite a divergence in terms of the states. And then secondly, as Katja mentioned, and I mentioned before, the AU has got massive ambitions for peace operations, both philosophically and practically, but it lacks the capabilities to do it on its own. And so the game in town has been what I call partnership peacekeeping. The African Union is willing to do boots on the ground and is willing to go on offense and use force and sort of ditch impartiality in the way the UN does. But it can't do the logistics sustainment itself. It can't do the mission support itself. It can't finance the missions itself and do allowances. So it has to pull in the UN and the European Union and then various bilateral players. And obviously we could have, if our conversation had gone differently, right, we could have talked about financing peace operations as a major factor in how, you know, the future of these missions is going to play out. And that's where I think the African Union is at the moment. It has big ambitions, but it wants the operational capacity that at the moment has to come from elsewhere.
Right. I think you're very correct in bringing in those limitations and the importance of the logistics also. Mattia, would you like to add something? Do you have your hand up?
I mean, just one sentence, that one thing that kind of also is an added dimension is that obviously all of these developments that Katerina and Paul are describing is then also impacting the UN peace operations themselves. Because if you think about it, sort of traditionally, most of the peacekeepers, including the Global South peacekeepers, would be coming from outside the regions. The countries would not be sort of having a lot of the vested interest in sort of the political dynamics. Right now, we're kind of seeing, even within sort of Global South, if you want to call it, contributors, there's kind of contributors that are coming from regions that might have been rehatted from previous regional operations are now in sort of UN missions. And that is obviously impacting sort of how the UN missions are then prepared to react to the kind of threats that are being seen on the ground, but also has an impact on sort of, I'll just say, principle of impartiality in the end. So that's the only thing that I kind of wanted to add, but yeah.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question. There's a question about humanitarian aid coming in, and this is not something we spent too much time on. And the tension between humanitarian aid and the desirability of some degree of self-reliance of local communities in crisis or in post-conflict situations. Connor, would you like to address this issue?
Yeah, I can do this very briefly because I was an aid worker. And there's basically two schools of thought around within the humanitarian aid community about how we should give aid. There's the camp, which is traditionally associated with Red Cross neutrality, but probably most now associated with MSF, Médicos Sans Frontières, which is that it should be needs-based. We should give aid where it's needed to help people. With the local capacity for peace or do no harm, gosh, I forgot her name, Mary. an Anglo-Saxon approach, which is that humanitarian aid should be used to promote peace building, human rights, liberal peace. About 15 or 20 years ago, most aid organizations agreed with the using humanitarian aid to promote peacekeeping, to promote peace, to promote human rights, to promote reconciliation. I would say now the vast majority of humanitarian aid organizations follow a needs-based approach. We should give it where it's needed, and we should give it under conditions of strict impartiality. And that's basically partly because of the huge onslaught. I mean, I lost count of the number of my colleagues that were murdered working in conflict zones, and there was a huge pushback within the humanitarian aid community in getting involved in politics, in trying to do anything other than feed people and help people and provide people with life-saving support. We saw that particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq, where aid workers became targets, and there was a general view that getting involved in politics, getting involved in peace building, in rights-based things would identify us as being on one side or the other of the conflict. So I think most organizations now would take a needs-based approach to it. Having said which, there is also a debate about the extent to which pouring vast amounts of international aid into conflict-starved, into resource-starved communities can exacerbate dependency, can create war economies, can disempower people. And the way in which I think most humanitarian aid organizations are now moving is away from giving things towards giving cash. And cash-based humanitarian aid is increasingly seen as the best way to empower people. There's a kind of prejudice that if you give people money, the men will take it and drink it or buy guns with it. But there's many, many ways in which you can inject cash, giving it directly to people through their mobile phones, in ways that stimulates local economies, in that empowers people, individuals, and creates economic rejuvenation. So I think within the humanitarian aid community, those are the two biggest debates that have taken place around how we help people in crisis. And my just last point, because I forgot to say it before, on refugees, one thing that we really do need to stress is that there are more refugees and internally displaced people in the world today than ever before in human history. And that's because conflicts are continuing. So while I like Paul's optimism about the future for peace operations, we have to accept that more people today have been uprooted and driven from their homes than ever before in human history. Most of them stay in the global south. Desperate numbers trying to get into Europe or across the border with the United States. It's a massively political issue. But I think we should all remember that the world is suffering, and the most visible sign of that suffering is the number of people who are fleeing for their lives from conflicts of all sorts of natures. And that's including climate change, including the new wars, including conflicts in where there are peacekeeping missions and where there aren't peacekeeping missions. But the world has become a very, very violent place. And that's a huge indictment on all of us, I think.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right in reminding us of that fact. So whatever positives are coming out of peacekeeping, there's also many negatives coming out of, let's say, the broader framework for sustaining peace and promoting stability internationally. Well, I think we've had a really rich discussion. It's 9:45. Through the questions that were submitted by the viewers, we have also managed to look at so many different angles of an issue that is complex and fascinating, but one on which consensus will be difficult to reach. I think we can agree on a few of the points that were raised today. Peace operations are not facing extinction. No, I don't think they are. They have survived as a useful tool. They are producing positive results in many parts of the world. A large number of people are dedicating themselves, including the panelists in today's discussions, to refine concepts and to look at what is more effective, to look at lessons learned, and have objective assessments of recent performance. It seems that going towards more robust or even peace enforcement type mandates in the future, as we've seen in the Congo, is not the necessary answer. I know that one Brazilian general, Santos Cruz, played an important role in that, and he advocates for this line. But interestingly, the foreign ministry in Brasilia has not really bought that. And I think it's a very, even though he's had very good reviews for his work in Haiti and in Congo. I thought, and I believe there is wide agreement among all of us that looking at a bottom-up approach and placing emphasis on rule of law and institution building is a desirable objective. I don't think anyone disagrees that the Peacebuilding Commission is an interesting new forum that can be better taken advantage of. Right now, actually under Egyptian chairmanship. So I've been having some conversations here in Cairo about that. Of course, no matter how refined the concepts and how effective the peacekeepers are and how intelligent Security Council members become, this will never obviate the need for diplomacy, for mediation, for peaceful efforts at preventing conflict. One issue we didn't actually touch on was sanctions and embargoes and how those can be part of a strategy that also reduces violence and paves the way for some kind of resolution or civilization. And finally, I think we all agree, maybe not on the specifics, but on the general need for Security Council reform, especially in times of rise in great power tensions. You need more countries, I would say, with the, well, I'll talk about the historic profile of Brazil that actually has a capacity to engage with a variety of players and in ways that hopefully in the past and maybe in the future underlying a commitment to, let's say, systemic improvement rather than to advancing any kind of hegemonic agenda, improvement in the system itself. I believe Luis Fernandes is no longer with us, so I'm not sure I should give the floor back to him, but if anybody would like to add anything at this point, Kai Kenko or other participants, I would like to thank you all. I learned quite a bit. It has been a refresher course for me tonight, and certainly has stimulated to read more into the matter as Brazil prepares to go back to the Security Council next year.
Just maybe to thank everyone again in the name of the Institute and the other institutions involved, and really for a very high level panel. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. That was really good. Thanks a lot. And it's nice to see you all too, finally, even if virtual.
Are we still on YouTube live?
No, I don't think so. I think we are actually, because we are. There we go.
Recording stop. Okay.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to have to, I've got another meeting coming up, but it was lovely talking to you all. Great to see so many people after so long. Let's do it again sometime.
Hope to see you all in person sometime soon.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for moderating so effectively.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. Thank you, Oslo. Thank you, Scotland, Rio, and Vancouver. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.